Hello and welcome to the Literaturforum im Brecht-Haus, more precisely to the basement, to another edition of the Jacobiner Club, as the name suggests, a cooperation with Jacobin magazine. Tonight's topic will be the cultural scientist and critic of capitalism Mark Fisher and his book Postcapitalist Desire, the Final Lectures, which was first published in German this year under the title Sehnsucht nach dem Kapitalismus. Matt Colquhoun and Alex Brentler will lead the discussion. Adelaide Ivánova, a poet who works at Jacobin magazine, will moderate the discussion. Thank you so much. And something important, Minibar Moralia provides nice cocktails tonight, such as the Cosmoproletarian, for example. Get your cocktail after the show and pay what you want or what you can. And now, please give our guests a warm round of applause.
Hallo, es ist an, oder? Ja, ich muss eine kleine Intro auf Deutsch machen. Bear with me. So, wir sind heute im Jacobiner Club. Herzlich willkommen, dass ihr alle da seid. Jacobin Nummer 16 ist vor kurzem raus und Vereinigte Märkte von Europa. Es geht um Europawahl. Aber der Grund, warum wir heute da sind, ist genau wegen Mark Fishers Moment. Ich bin nervös. Deswegen sind wir heute da, wegen Sehnsucht nach dem Kapitalismus. Wurde vom Brumer Verlag dieses Jahr, glaube ich, März veröffentlicht, mit Übersetzungen von Alex Brentler und eine sehr schöne Illustration und Design von Andy King. Ich werde jetzt zu Englisch switchen, Gott sei Dank. And then we can introduce our guests a little bit better. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Hello. Did I say everything, Ola, that I had to say? Thank you. Oof. So Matt Colquhoun is a writer and photographer from Hull, UK, best known for writing about the late Mark Fisher. Their most recent book, Narcissus in Bloom, was published by Repeater Books in 2023. Currently a PhD candidate in philosophy at Newcastle University. They blog at xenogothic.com. Hi, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Alex Brentler is a writer, translator, and former editor at Jacobin, Germany. We miss you. So before we start, we will read, or Matt will read a little bit of the book, and then Alex will also read a little bit of the translation.
Great. Ooh. Okay, hear me well. Thank you for coming tonight and for accommodating me as a stereotypically monolingual Brit. It's much appreciated. I'm going to read just the final paragraphs of the introduction to the book, written a few years ago, which may be slightly out of context since it's so short, but we'll give it a go. It was certainly not Fisher's intention to publish his thoughts in a form such as this. But at a time when his works are being deployed in service of all manner of projects, there remains no better person to clarify his thoughts than Fisher himself, and it is a thought that certainly requires some clarification. In late 2017, for instance, acid communism was taken up in the UK by a soft left contingent directly linked to the Labour Party, who attempted to further embolden a resurgent democratic socialism by combining it with an entwined rave hippie nostalgia, even going so far as to call for a re-engagement with those aspects of hippiedom that Fisher had always been so suspicious of. Later renamed acid Corbynism to ground it more firmly in its contemporary movement, this movement did remain loyal to many of Fisher's concerns, such as the need to raise a new collective consciousness, but it also retained many of the qualities that Fisher saw as detrimental to any resurgent countercultural cause. This movement failed to take into account that central problematic within all of his writings, the crisis of the negative. This is to say that collective joy is a superficial salve for an individualized melancholy if neither is capable of producing the new. We must find a way to intervene in both, in their entwined totality that is capable of moving us forwards. By disregarding this tensile core of Fisher's dialectically psychedelic project, any posthumous acid communism is doomed to be little more than a folk politics. And if the contents of the first 5 lectures of this course are anything to go by, Fisher had much more in store for his readers than that. With this in mind, it is our hope that these lectures will be a useful resource, providing a broader foundation to the acid communism project than has previously been available. In many ways, it is astounding that an interest in acid communism has been stoked by so little, an unfinished introduction to the book that was published posthumously. This is a testament to the lucidity of Fisher's drafts, never mind his finished texts. Whilst the texts gathered here may similarly warrant the label of drafts, they nonetheless constitute something much more than an introduction. They are presented instead with the partial unravelling of an Ariadnean thread, and this is an unravelling we are all implored to continue in his absence. This may be an uncomfortable suggestion to some. It is undoubtedly Fisher's capability as a guide in this regard, his talents as a stalker even, traversing capitalism's weird and eerie zones, that has led to the growing interest in his thought since his untimely death. Even those who are not familiar with his work before 2017 find themselves expressing the same sentiment that has been expressed online over and over again. I wish Mark Fisher was here, to guide, to inform, to give us confidence, to give us a laugh. But in each instance, it is clear that the questions Fisher asked of Jean-Francois Lyotard and Sleaford Mods remain pertinent to his own project, as well as those inspired by his legacy. Who will make contact with the anger and frustration he articulated? In addition, who will make contact with the joy and energy he created as well? The answers to these questions is not an individual, but a collective. It was not Fisher himself, but a people yet to come. Thank you.
Okay, I'll read the same section in German. Fisher selbst hatte nicht die Intention, seine Überlegungen in dieser Form zu publizieren. Da seine Werke inzwischen aber für alle möglichen Projekte herangezogen werden, gibt es wohl keine bessere Person, um seine Position klarzustellen als er selbst. Und diese Klärung ist auch sicherlich notwendig. Gegen Ende des Jahres 2017 versammelte sich unter dem Banner des Acid-Kommunismus in Großbritannien eine Fraktion der Soft Left mit direkten Verbindungen zur Labour Party und einem Versuch, einen wiedererstarkenden demokratischen Sozialismus durch eine ausgeprägte Hippie- und Rave-Nostalgie weiter zu unterfüttern. Sie gingen sogar so weit, für eine erneute Auseinandersetzung mit den Elementen der Hippie-Kultur zu werben, denen Fisher am meisten misstraute. Später gab man sich das Label Acid-Corbynismus, um noch deutlicher Bezug auf die Tagespolitik zu nehmen. Zwar blieb diese Bewegung vielen von Fishers wichtigsten Zielen treu, wie etwa der Schaffung eines neuen kollektiven Bewusstseins, ihr hafteten aber auch viele der Eigenschaften an, in denen Fisher Hindernisse für die Entstehung einer neuen Gegenkultur sah. Letztlich ignorierte diese Bewegung die zentrale Problematik seines Gesamtwerks, die Krise des Negativen. Denn kollektiver Genuss ist ein oberflächlicher Trost für individualisierte Melancholie, wenn aus beidem nichts Neues erwächst. Wir müssen Wege finden, wie wir in beides intervenieren können, in ihre verstickte Totalität, denn nur so kommen wir voran. Jeder posthume Acid-Kommunismus, der dieses Spannungsverhältnis außer Acht lässt, das den Kern von Fishers dialektisch-psychedelischem Projekt bildet, ist dazu verurteilt, wenig mehr als volkstümliche Politik zu bleiben. Und nach den ersten 5 Vorträgen seines Seminars zu urteilen, hatte Fisher seiner Leserschaft sehr viel mehr zu bieten. In diesem Sinne ist es unsere Hoffnung, dass diese Vorträge eine nützliche Ressource bieten, um den Acid-Kommunismus auf eine neue Basis zu stellen, die bisher nicht verfügbar war. Es ist erstaunlich, dass das Interesse am Acid-Kommunismus auf so wenig und vor allem so unvollständigem Material gründet, was von der Klarheit von Fishers Entwürfen zeugt, um nicht von seinen fertigen Texten zu sprechen. Obwohl man die hier gesammelten Texte ebenfalls als Entwürfe bezeichnen könnte, bieten sie dennoch sehr viel mehr als eine Einführung. Vor uns liegt stattdessen ein teilweise entrollter Ariadne-Faden und wir sind dazu eingeladen, ihn in Fischers Abwesenheit weiter zu entrollen. Vielleicht mögen manche von dieser Vorstellung irritiert sein. Es ist zweifelsohne Fischers Talent als Pfadfinder, vielleicht sogar als Nachsteller in den seltsamen und unheimlichen Zonen des Kapitalismus, das seit seinem Tod zu einem wachsenden Interesse an seinem Werk geführt hat. Selbst von denen, die sein Denken vor 2017 gar nicht kannten, hört man immer wieder dasselbe. Wäre doch nur Mark Fisher noch unter uns. Um uns Orientierung zu bieten, uns zu informieren, uns Selbstvertrauen zu geben und uns zum Lachen zu bringen. Jedenfalls ist offensichtlich, dass die Fragen, die Fisher an Lyotard und des Lyford-Mords stellte, für sein eigenes Projekt relevant bleiben, wie auch für alle, die sich von seinem Werk inspirieren haben lassen. Wer wird die Wut und die Frustration, die er artikulierte, aufgreifen? Wer wird die Freude und Energie, die er zum Ausdruck brachte, ebenfalls neu hervorrufen? Dies wird nicht durch ein Individuum, sondern kollektiv möglich sein. Fisher selbst wird dies nicht leisten können. Es bleibt eine Aufgabe für eine Bewegung, die es noch nicht gibt.
Thank you. I find it very on point when you say, maybe I'm speculating and you guys have another opinion, but I think it's very on point when you say that a lot of people think, like, I wish Mark Fisher was here to develop thinking and discussions about certain topics. I know for sure that in the group that I'm active at, he is very constantly mentioned, which is quite brilliant if you are a writer and people actually put your thinking into practice in activism. But before we talk about this, I actually would like to know, how did Mark Fisher enter your life? As a writer or a friend, I don't know the stories. I would love to hear from you too.
I was a long-time reader of the K-Punk blog. Initially, I had a blog myself for a very long time and still do. But yeah, initially trained as a photographer. I don't know why now. It felt like a good idea at the time. And then just got more and more interested in Mark Fisher's work, but also with his colleagues, like Kojo Eshin. And when I discovered that both of them were teaching at Goldsmiths in London, I decided to do a master's there. And then, met Mark Fisher in late 2016. And then the rest is unfortunately history. That's kind of where that was the year that these lectures were given. And so many different things happened.
Yeah, I think the first time I heard of Mark was in 2014. I think that's when the Vampire Castle essay came out. Yeah, and actually I wasn't even particularly involved on the left at the time. I spent my 20s coding, more or less. So, but that essay certainly made the rounds and even reached me. And I mean, it sparked a huge debate on social media and so forth. And I read it, and it really spoke to me. And ever since I've kind of known who Mark Fisher is, and I was familiar more as peripherally with his work, and then of course we had this very cool opportunity at Brumaire to translate this book, and I was asked if I wanted to do it, and it was a really cool opportunity. So I've gotten to know Mark's work in a much more intense way through this process of translating this book. Of course, it's, I wasn't properly familiar with him other than through some of his writings. And it was certainly eye-opening, and there's no one really quite like him still. I think if people are aware, please let me know. But I certainly I think I'm as fascinated by him and his writings as many other people are too.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, like this fascination. Like in my head, we're friends, And it's really, I was super excited to meet you, because then I thought I would be making questions like, and how was he like in real life? But because I don't know if everyone has took a look at the book already, but it's like transcripts from his last lectures. And there's like Studierende number 12, and then the sentence that this person said. And I was wondering if you were one of the students, and you explained me a little bit the context.
Yeah, I think and it's a fair assumption to ask which student I was, but I wasn't there. Not directly in the classroom. The department, it was the visual cultures department that Mark was working in at the time. And it's so much worse now, but this kind of neoliberalization of the university, and especially the humanities, this course that was called Contemporary Art Theory was this strange amalgam of a bunch of much smaller courses. So as a student arriving there, you could choose from a dozen different modules that you could do. You could pick 2 to do in the course of a year. And as much as I had actually gone to Goldsmiths to study under Mark, there was too much to choose from. So I didn't do his course. I'd intended to audit it afterwards, or after Christmas actually, settle in. And then that wasn't possible. And I was gutted about that and was so disappointed. But then I think in wanting to kind of make up for that missed opportunity, ended up engaging so much more with Mark's work. And yeah, my first book, at least in English, was called Egress on Morning Melancholy of Mark Fisher. And it's a kind of, I guess the popular term is auto theory at this point. It was kind of a diary of 2017, the time after Mark's death, and all that was happening politically in the UK and elsewhere, and expanding on his thought, and seeing all the places that it went, how it could be applied to the present. That book came out in English in March 2020, which was an interesting time in itself. It was a week before we locked down for the pandemic, and it was. I think it had a mixed reception. I think partly because the Mark Fisher that I described in the book wasn't that well known. So a few weeks later, I'd been sitting on these recordings from the lectures for a few years. They'd been shared around a lot. They were actually already online, but no one seemed to engage with them. And they felt so important that, yeah, in the first sort of coronavirus lockdown, I set about transcribing them all. And now we have this book that no one expected to actually do very well. It was going to be an ebook only, and then interest just grew and grew, and now it's been translated. I think a Spanish translation's also just come out very recently. And there's a Japanese translation. It's taken on a life of its own, which is very surprising, but also speaks to the increasing posthumous popularity of Mark's work.
That's very nice to hear that so many translations are coming out, and I'm also happy to hear that the book has is having so many re-editions, because while I was reading it, I also had a strong feeling that it was an important healing process to transcribe it and then to put it out there. And on that note, I would like to know more about the topics that Fisher brings in the book related to the times in which he was preparing those lectures. For example, why do you think he was thinking about desire and post-capitalism in 2016?
I think especially in the UK, there were so many questions around what kind of future do we want? And I think that's true in general. I mean, 2016 was the main sort of thing hanging over that time was it was just before Trump was elected. So those few months before Mark's death, that was all anybody was talking about. The possibility, or what seemed at the time the impossibility, that could happen. But also 2016 was the Brexit referendum. So there was a lot of, the atmosphere was just like, why are we going after? Why are we voting for just these quite sad things, really? And I think Mark says in the lectures themselves, he doesn't reference Deleuze and Guattari, but they're the kind of spectre that hangs over the course for him. And I think there's their line from Anti-Oedipus, the question that Wilhelm Reich puts together or something, the one that Spinoza knew so well. I'm paraphrasing terribly. But yeah, why do we fight for our servitude as if it were our freedom? Something like that. That being their central question of desire and its relationship to capitalism. And I think for Mark, who was so inspired by their work specifically, those questions had become increasingly more pertinent at a time when, it seemed everybody was, it was turkeys voting for Christmas sort of feeling.
I think it's very interesting that you bring this idea of futurity, because combined with the mental health topics that were so important to him and to his writing, and if you're struggling with depression or whatever it is, you have really a hard time already visualizing the possibility of building a future, even though the context outside can be great, but it doesn't matter when you're facing mental health issues. But then it's not only this mental landscape that is going on, is everything else that is like more or less falling apart. And I think he translated this mindset very well. But as an educator myself, I always think, like, when I'm invited to give like creative writings workshops or whatever, the last thing I think about is poetry, and more like how can I bring the current topics of society to a classroom, so that people discuss those topics through poetry or literature or whatever. And I was wondering, like, how do you think that for him, this process of translating what is happening out there to the classroom, to the process of teaching, how do you think it was his process, or how did you experience while transcribing the text, the audio?
Yeah, there is it's probably an unfortunate metaphor, but it's kind of apt, and not to sort of labelled as a diagnosis, but there's a bipolarity to Mark's thought. There is this deep melancholia, this great frustration and hatred of the present, but also a lot of joy. And there was it was one of his final lengthy blog posts in one of the general election campaigns in the UK. It was called Abandon Hope, Summer is Coming. I think it was a play on trying to invert the Game of Thrones Winter is Coming thing, something like that. But Mark has this thing, he had this thing there that, there's all this talk of political hope, but what we really need is confidence. And that was very much, I think, what he really did bring to the classroom. He kind of and I hope it's something that does come across in the transcription. It was kind of the most interesting part of doing it, was trying to kind of capture the inflections, the atmosphere in the room beyond just Mark's words. Because there was, even then, I remember I'm still kind of haunted by seeing Mark a few weeks before he died. And outside of the classroom, he was kind of a bit of a shell. He was very, very just like there was a dark cloud over him. But then in the classroom, completely the opposite. He had this confidence and hope that, better things weren't just. I think it wasn't just that better things are possible; they're already here. They're unfolding. And what strategies, what tactics can be used to, accelerate those processes, which is something that comes into the lectures too, I think. And it's a tension in his work that I think is kind of had an impact on. I always think of there's Tom York from Radiohead. He was interviewed for the BBC years ago, and he has this comment about going to see a Mark Rothko exhibition in the Tate, and he sort of says he notices that he looks at the adults that are walking around the gallery and taking in the paintings, and all they see is a man that killed himself. But then you watch the children that are in that exhibition, and all they see are the bright colours and the paintings and things. And I think that Mark's works had a very similar reception. People now only see him as this man who committed suicide, but they miss the colour and the vibrancy that's very much there. Wow,
that's a really nice way to describe. I didn't know this Tom York interview, but as I was reading, I had the feeling that I was listening to someone who really had the love for teaching. And I was more or less surprised that he doesn't mention Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, at any moment, because it's very there, the love for the students and how he takes the students seriously, but also how he appears to be enjoying sharing this knowledge with the students, so that, you know, people get inspired to keep living, even though, you know, everything looks so bad.
Well, that was one thing too that I forgot to mention.
Please.
That does summarise that point, because it was the title of the introduction is "No More Miserable Monday Mornings," and that was a mixtape that Mark had made and put on the K-Punk blog, without any fanfare, just an MP3 and a track list. But in private, Monday mornings were when his class was scheduled. And I think that was particularly significant for him. Monday morning being kind of so associated with the beginning of the working week and the drudgery, and everybody gets the Sunday sads maybe or something before you start the 9 to 5. For Mark, that changed at that point, and teaching was his favourite thing, I think, at that time.
Yeah, it's very feelable if this word exists. But talking about work, I would love to hear from Alex about a little bit about the translation process. One thing that I'm curious about is especially the title. I'm not a native German speaker, but what I do know about German language is that it has so many words for one thing. So why not, like, okay, post-capitalism desire, it could have been Begehren, it could have been Lust, could have been Postcapitalismus, but then you chose nach dem Kapitalismus. Yes. Can you share with us a little bit about it?
Sure, yeah. The title is something we came up with in a long meeting at the Jacobin offices, and I forget whose idea it was. I don't think it was mine, but I can't quite. I apologize to whoever came up with it. But of course, I mean, to any German speakers, I don't need to explain this, but it works on two levels. It's your desire, the post-capitalist desire, like the English title, but also the desire that you have for capitalism. And in terms of what it was like to work on the book, it's not an easy text for a translator, at least not for me, because it's very dense and very theoretical, and there's a lot of ideas, and Mark jumps around a lot, and he makes all these connections that you don't expect. But then at the same time, it's very conversational, and that's sometimes challenging to put these two things together, particularly in German. And but you really, you work your way through it, and then after 2 or 3 passes, you get it to a point where you think, okay, I think this is more or less what would have happened at a German university if Mark Fisher was German and lecturing in German. That's kind of the goal. But of course, there's always like difficult choices you have to make, like in any translation, and some things you can't really do justice to. But it was definitely also he talks about the idea of consciousness raising a lot in the book, and I think it was somewhat of an experience of consciousness raising to translate the book, because if you spend that much time with a text, you start to think about it in different ways. And for me, certainly, there were things also politically that came together in a new way, and I started to think of things differently. And I hope that readers will have the same sort of experience with the book.
It's nice that you mentioned the consciousness raising thing, because I was really moved to see him talking about it and taking it seriously, because more often than not, this is something that happened that was very important for feminist movements, that informed other groups also in their activism in the fight for justice, and that it's often ridiculed. There's something that is like, oh, people just sit in a room and talk about how their husbands beat them. And it's so much more than that and so much more influential. So I was really happy to see that being like that he took 2 chapters of the book to not only talk about the history of this, but the power of this practice. I didn't read the German translation. Can you tell us how you translate consciousness raising?
Bewusstseinsbildung.
Bewusstseinsbildung.
Bildung.
Dankeschön. Thank you. So, while I was reading the English version, Alex, like getting this feeling that Mark Fisher was on a mission to make his students get active and to, to participate in transformative actions. And there is this feeling throughout that is really impossible to translate. So I was wondering, like, where were the moments that you were like, oh my God, I cannot do this? Or that, that you had to spend more time focused on, was there more complicated chapter? Like the Lyotard chapter, that was a tough one. Yeah, I would like to hear from you about the not so fun parts of the work.
Yeah, the Lyotard is, that took up a lot of time, and kind of an exacerbating factor was that it's I couldn't get hold of a PDF of Lyotard in German, so I had to look it up in the printed edition, which took some time, but no, it's really more I think, trying to do justice to the personality of Mark Fisher. He's very, very good with the students, very diplomatic, very accommodating. It's sometimes not that easy to be this diplomatic in German, but I tried my best. But you can really you get the feeling how much he loved teaching and how much he loved the students, and I tried to convey that in a text. And here or there's funny moments, and it's, you also try to be genuine to, I'm sure, you to the recording and I to the English text. There's sometimes he trails off and then he doesn't quite finish what he started, and you have to convey it in an authentic way, but I think that was sort of the most challenging aspect overall. Just it's not your usual kind of academic text. It's not journalism. It's not it's not a novel. So it has its unique challenges, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Would you like? I'm just like keep going on. Would you like to comment on something or for each other? I also have questions. I can't keep going.
You put me on the spot now. No, I mean it's great. It's fascinating for me to hear too, because I mean it's the I mean, it was a few years ago now. For me, it was nearly 4 years ago of actually transcribing the thing, but it's a very particular process, and so I'd like to formally apologise for the nightmare that it can be at times. It was a nightmare to listen to as well, but worth it, I think, very much so.
How long did it take to transcribe?
Oh God,
the things?
The lectures in the 5 lectures were about 2 hours each. So it would take 10 hours to listen through. I think it was also, it's important maybe to know, I very much hope it doesn't come through in the text in either version. But this was my, some people took up baking in lockdown. I did this when time was not real, and I actually couldn't tell you how long it took. Probably about 6 months. But yeah, I'd all but lost my mind by that point, I think.
Yeah, there were moments like that during the translation where I felt similarly, and it took a long time. It's not an easy text. I think we can agree on that.
Yes.
What I would like to is to go dive a little bit more in the content, in this invitation that Marx did to his students to, join some type of transformative action and be loving and trust the process, even though everything feels shitty. What do you think, Matt, that the things that Mark Fisher taught us in general, but with this book in particular, that we could apply in real life in 8 years later?
Yeah, I think I think what's most important for me about even putting this book together is that it shows, as sad as it is that it's unfinished, I think it's so important that this is Mark developing a positive project, in the sense of, as Alex mentioned, I mean, capitalist realism is still probably his best-known work that is fundamentally a critique, quite obviously. Even Exiting the Vampire Castle, which was so controversial at the time when it was released, in English. And I think partly because for many people that particular critique went too far. And Mark was I think had a pretty bad time after it was published. It's kind of, I think it's important that you mention how much time he spends with consciousness raising, because and this is something I wrote an essay about this for a newspaper back home last year when the revelations came out about Russell Brand, because Mark kind of in the Exiting the Vampire Castle talks about Russell Brand in very positive terms, which is very unfortunate. And I think it was at the time. People were already very aware of Brand's sort of sexism. And what Mark saw in him is debatable of how, that was the debate of how useful is a figure like that. Having someone so popular who was nonetheless was on UK television a lot, talking about radical ideas. How useful was it that it was Russell Brand? Anyway, the main thing that I think the main critique I think that hurt Mark the most after that essay was that a lot of people dismissed him as an anti-feminist. That in this text being sort of a very trying to describe and critique what many people would now call cancel culture. This was Mark writing a reactionary essay in the early years of the culture war. And it's an essay that I've got very mixed feelings about for that reason. I think it does do Mark's thought in general a disservice. That being said, I think this project, it goes beyond the critique. It shows that if that's a kind of diagnosis, rather than being so negative, and I guess from the part of the introduction that I read, this, I think it's something from Alain Badiou, when he talks about the crisis of the negative, we are, as a culturally and as a society maybe or whatever, we're very good at destroying the old but not producing the new, was Badiou's argument. And I think Mark had realized at a certain point that he was kind of being guilty of that too. He'd become very well known for attempts to pull down the ideological scaffolding of our present moment, but what was he offering up that was more positive? And I think this text is an attempt to do that nonetheless which accounts for its difficulty, I think. This isn't Mark simply saying, if we're all happy and love one another, everything will be fine. He acknowledges that it's a lot more complicated than that, but he stays with the trouble, as it were. And I think, again, it's sad that it's kind of cut off. It was meant to be a 15-week course. We get 5 of those lectures. But there is a momentum here anyway, I think, for building that positive project and staying with the difficulties that are involved in building a positive leftist project.
Yeah, I can definitely I agree with all of that. He doesn't let you get away with your bullshit. Like, he really challenges you, and he goes where it hurts, and he asks really tough questions, and of any reader, I think. And that's I think that's what was so fascinating reading the book several times over, translating it, that these questions, they started to work on me as well, and I hope it will be the same for readers. And but I think, if from my perspective, even though it's of course it's not the whole course, it's incomplete, but I think he gets close to a very fair and thorough analysis and post-mortem of the countercultural model of doing politics. And I think it's the assessment that he offers, I think, is very fair. And he talks about the successes and the failures of the counterculture and of doing politics through counterculture. And I think he, throughout the text, it becomes clear, okay, here's what we have to work on, here's what we have to develop further. Because, right now, we're in a situation, I think, on the left where we can't change mainstream culture. We don't have the numbers. We're not strong enough. But doing politics through counterculture doesn't seem to really work that well either. The model seems to have its limitations, and it seems to have run its course years ago, probably decades ago. And it's not a blueprint for what else we could do, but I think there's a lot of good ideas in the text, and that's what I took from it.
Which good ideas?
I think I think this is the role that the Lyotard chapter plays in the book. I think Mark lays out a very convincing case for, of course, leftist politics has to be a cultural politics. There's no such thing as like a purely material politics. Nobody believes that, not even the good people at Jacobin. But the question is how do you achieve that? Like, if you want a different kind of society, if you need to change people's political consciousness, but what is the process to do so? And I think if we can't do it through just brute force in mainstream culture, and we can't do it through the counterculture, then the question is, okay, we somehow have to do it in our own space, but in mainstream culture at the same time. And I think the answer that I took from the book is that we have to work in institutions that are located within mainstream culture, that are open to pretty much everyone and anybody, but that develop an internal culture that is not defined as being, a rejection of mainstream culture, but that opens up a space where consciousness can develop and where mainstream culture can change within our leftist spaces. Because he talks about experiences that people had with living in communes and so forth, and he references the Adam Curtis documentary. I forgot which one it is, but I think it's I think it's All Looked Over by Machines of Loving Grace, and it's a very kind of unvarnished look at what it was like back then, at what the counterculture achieved, but also at its shortcomings. And a lot of these projects, it turned a little bit into a shit show. I mean, if we talk about regressive gender politics today, which is, a huge issue for the right and something that they really mobilize around, the real trad wives were living in communes back then. So I think he really challenges you to think about these issues very sincerely and very deeply. And I think that's what we need for a left that can be successful again and can win again. I think we need a different mode of doing cultural politics that is realistic, that we can actually achieve, but that doesn't that sort of doesn't repeat the mistakes of the counterculture and its shortcomings. But I don't know, maybe you disagree.
No, I do agree. I think one of Mark's most important concepts, I think, that's maybe lesser known, but he would often talk on the blog about a sense of a popular modernism. Popular modernism, which he... Popular modernism. Modernism, okay. Yeah. Which he would define for Mark when he was growing up, effectively as like a post-punk, I suppose, in the late 70s and probably more in the 80s. Probably a bit too young in the 70s. But in the 80s, yes, and he would write on the blog about bands like The Jam, who were, having hit singles, were exceedingly popular, maybe even mainstream, but had songs that were communicating and, raising consciousness. And that was partly, I think, the argument in Mark's Exiting the Vampire Castle essay. The prevailing problem that people had with figures like Russell Brand or the UK journalist Owen Jones was they were always accused of selling out. And I guess people have heard that plenty of times before. I always associate it in my head with like Kurt Cobain. When a counterculture or a subcultural aesthetics makes contact with the mainstream, it's all but null and void. And Mark's argument, I think, especially in that essay, is that if we are going to, if we don't want to back a particular individual that's been produced and kind of elevated by capitalism, if we want to wait for a cultural messaging that emerges outside of capitalism, we're going to be waiting a very long time. And I think that, but the problem then is that, our mainstream culture industries also are very good at chewing up these people. Mark edited Mark's first, well, not quite his first book. I guess it kind of is Mark's first book before Capitalist Realism, which he edited for Zero Books, was a book about Michael Jackson. He had plans to do something else later on. According to Kojo Eshin, who he shared an office with at Goldsmiths, they wanted to do an edited collection together called Kanye Theory. I guess Russell Brand's another figure.
Talking about aging badly.
Yes, well, exactly. That's precisely my point, though, in a way. It's like there is this... I mean, how do you explain a figure like Kanye West than, you know, someone going from, I think, a very significant and very important politicizing voice in popular culture to then, insanity. And being kind of just reprehensible. And I think part of that, I mean, this is maybe a pet theory, but I don't understand how anybody can be that kind of stature of celebrity and still keep all of their marbles, as it were. And that's a problem. That's a problem for cultural politics. And I think that was partly what Mark was interested in. How do you walk that line between retaining some kind of, you know, subcultural, countercultural critiques of the mainstream, whilst being able to proliferate your message enough that it actually has an impact on what it's critiquing, if that makes sense. I think it's not a question, well, it partly is a question that Mark would ask in various different places, particularly towards the end of his life. I've got a lot else on my plate, and it probably won't be me anyway, but there is another book of essays that I think should be done from around this time. I guess we're kind of talking about, and it's actually what's so nice to be doing this event here. I arrived early and went to go see Herbert Marcuse next door. And one of the lectures is Mark talking about Herbert Marcuse and Ellen Willis. And he has an essay that I'd recommend to people that is online. It was published by eFlux, and it's called, it's a quote from Ellen Willis. It's a social and psychic revolution of almost inconceivable magnitude, popular culture's interrupted accelerationist dreams. And that's basically Mark, maybe the chapter that would have been in Acid Communism, but talking about those same ideas. And precisely, that disappointment. Marcuse is someone who's writing kind of at the beginning of the counterculture, is so inspirational for it. Ellen Willis, who's writing after its dreams have kind of died. And I think Mark, very consciously, no pun intended, wanted to hold both of those sort of temporalities together. How do we hold both of those things, not just the idea of cultural artifacts that we might think of as prefiguring a kind of cultural revolution, or maybe something not in grander those terms, but it's a better world, and the things that are also being produced now that mourn what we've lost. And I think in a way that's partly, for me anyway, that's kind of that defining structure of feeling for modernism too. Always so of that make it new mantra that comes with a melancholy from of what has supposedly been lost. But that's the kind of perfect mixture, and that's everywhere. We're just kind of maybe not finding a way to really make that tension as productive as it could be.
I think one of the good tricks to make this mixture not as effective as it could be, and that's something that Max talks about in the book, is the role of the resentment as a feeling that is induced by the reactionaries, but also this resentment with those who get to power or to cultural recognizement. And I wanted to, we don't have much time left, but I would like to start going to the end of our talk today, and then maybe have time for one or two questions. There's a song from Beyoncé that I think it's quite genius and reflects what Mark Fisher has described as resentment as a tool of dividing the working class. In the song, Beyoncé is talking to Jay-Z, and she's talking to, actually, let me remember, I think she's talking to she's talking to him, to Jay-Z. It's from her second album, and she says something like, "How you dare give her what you should have given to me," which is how resentment works. When you look like other people getting things or getting recognition for what they do, just recently there was this post from the Linkspartei in which they are saying, "Oh, now Selbstbestimmungsgesetz, we made it," and then the comments are like, well, don't you care about the workers? And it's like, yeah, trans people work too. I don't know if you're aware, Anyway, so before we open to the questions of the audience, I would love to hear more about this game that he makes between identifying resentment as a very smart tool and then bringing optimism as a response to it. Dua Lipa's new album is called Radical Optimism. So bear in mind, things are changing maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I can have a go. So resentment is really, it pops up almost all across the book in various places. And yeah, I think it's, if you look at what's going on the right today and how we're frankly not doing a very good job at countering it, it's a huge problem. Of course, if you want to offer up a class politics as your politics on the left, and also not just as an answer to the right, but it should play that role as well. Resentment is can be a component of that, I think. But I think what's clear that for Mark, and I would totally agree with that, it's that it has to be more. So resentment can play a role on the left. I wouldn't disavow resentment, but you can't stop there. You have to, as you said, offer up a positive project. And I think the argument that he makes for why that's the case in the text is very strong, because if you just offer resentment, even from the left, it collapses in on itself. And I think, yeah, there's plenty places and times where that mistake has been made, and we shouldn't repeat it.
Yeah, and I think the Beyonce example is good. There's also another one that Mark does write about himself. Not Beyonce, but Destiny's Child. He's got a post about their song "Bills, Bills, Bills."
They keep coming.
Yeah, they do. And that song, I mean, Mark has a really interesting take on it, because I think it's a song. It's kind of about it's that classic kind of Destiny's Child, like female empowerment, kind of what we'd call now girl bossing or whatever. It's like, I'm making all this money, I'm the breadwinner now, that's great for me. Why are you, this layabout boyfriend who's not doing enough? Like, I don't want to be paying for all of your things. And but Mark has this take that rather than that being this like purely just parroting this kind of neoliberal sentiment, you kind of have to consider the other side too, that there is this, and it's that process of consciousness raising. It's significant that it's in a pop song, because as much as it could be one person singing about their individual partner, I guess that process of consciousness raising is when you have an individualized resentment and you have your own feelings, and then you talk to someone else and it's like, oh, I'm going through the same thing. And then suddenly in that feeling being shared, it's no longer individual and it becomes structural. It's not just the layabout boyfriend's fault, it's patriarchy, or whatever. And understanding that structural, those structures is integral to that consciousness raising process. And I think, that's what Mark really does pull towards in, talking about resentment. It's a seed. You can feel it in yourself individually, but then what do you do with that? How do you join that with other people's experiences and feelings? And I think partly, him wanting to counter the fact that that's not that radical of a process. We kind of do it all of the time, and that's exciting. It's it's a part of the same, and it's what Mark talks about in there. His essay on Marcuse and Ellen Willis. It seems what the hardest thing right now seems to be to retain this understanding from the 60s and 70s of this kind of second wave feminism that's completely rethinking, particularly like structures of the family and things like this. What's strangest looking back on that now is their confidence, not only that these things were possible, but they were already unfolding and emerging. And I think it's that in particular that Mark wanted to kind of reiterate. We're not entirely closed off from this politics that we have. It's not all wishful thinking. We have the tools for it right here already. There are pockets of it, pockets of these other ways of life developing. That's why a collective consciousness raising is so important. You need to join up the dots.
That's beautiful. That's a really nice way to put the. As I was reading the book, it reminded me a lot of the things that he spoke as like examples of how we could live with culture and culture as a transformative process. Reminded me a lot of the landless workers movement in Brazil. They're the biggest movement in Latin America, and they use culture in such a like informed and in a powerful way also. Not only that their members consume cultural things, but also that they're encouraged to produce it, and they make it everything possible that it gets mainstream, that it gets out there. You know, if you are a writer or if you're a musician and you're involved in the landless workers movement, like they do everything they can so that it gets famous. And it's not this like, oh my God, we're famous now, we shouldn't do it because we're leftists. So yeah, it's happening already. As you say, it happens all the time, actually. But I don't want to give the final word. Maybe people have questions. I think we would have time for like 2. And then fancy, and you guys get a microphone even. There's one hand there.
First one.
Hello. Yes, thank you for the interesting conversation. I have a question. I would like to. You said something about we don't need hope, we need confidence. I find this very interesting. Maybe a bit in conflict to what was said in other places today. Because I think a big problem in the German left is that we do not want to go where it hurts. This is a big problem, and sorry, but also with Jacobin a bit. I would like. I'm very fascinated about the myth of the fool as a revealing character, which you can see, for instance, in this adoption of Bartleby by Zizek, even though Zizek doesn't interpret him very well, or in the figurehead of Diogenes. What do you think about something like that? It's not really a positive vision, but it's a confident vision as a critique in the here and now, more like a punk thing.
The Bartleby, I would prefer not to.
Yes. Yes.
That kind of, I think, there is it's a confident refusal, right? A refusal to kind of engage. And I hear your point. I think it's a problem for the left everywhere. That, well, not even just the left. I think it's a sort of. You made me think of that line from David Hume. What does he say? Something like, "It is preferable to," or no, what was it? It is natural to prefer the destruction of the world to the scratching of your finger, which there's possibly a nice tying in with Marx. The end of the world is easy to imagine than the end of capitalism, sort of thing. It's a similar sort of logic, where if we were better at dealing with the difficulties collectively, we would probably be more willing to. Yeah, that's kind of the gambit, right? Why is it easier to imagine the end of not just the world but the end of life as we kind of, in the midst of a climate emergency, that we would prefer to just deal with the problems that are coming rather than get to the cause of them. I think it's not even just a problem of the left, and I think maybe there's partly there's a problem with that melancholia that a lot of these problems are made specific to the left. I think in a lot of ways they're kind of just broadly human faults, and maybe there's a case of thinking, with this kind of a certain sense of humanism or something that we should be better than that. I think that's partly what Mark gets at in the book, in the final lecture on Lyotard, as difficult as it is. We're wired in unfortunate ways. But a lot of what Mark was writing on long prior to his most famous books, when he was doing his PhD and a member of the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, there was all of this talk about. He has a blog post called Emotional Engineering. Always this kind of Spinozist outlook of we can. There are multiple ways in which we can change our thinking in that regard. Maybe there's a point to be made of to say that we need to deal with our own problems doesn't necessarily have to be like some kind of exposure therapy, or I don't know, like we all need to sit on the couch and talk about our unfortunate ways of thinking. There's not a kind of cognitive behavioral therapeutic element to it. There are many other ways that we can change our thinking, and we do it all of the time. And I guess, and I think that's partly this issue of confidence. There's rather than the hope that things can get better, it's the confidence is important. In that sense, again, I would prefer not to. That desire to refuse is also there. This as alongside these desires for all the things that capitalism gives us. Like Mark talks in the first lecture about. You're allowed to want a system other than capitalism and still go to Starbucks. I mean, that's not going to be the thing that breaks. That's not a contradiction that's going to break everything down. You have to think bigger than that, and understand that you do think in terms that are like fuck Starbucks whilst being in the queue or whatever. You can hold those two things together. The fact that one exists that is imagining something else, that's enough. Maybe it's not enough, but it's a starting point, and the fact it's already there is something to build on. It's not just that things aren't hopeless. There's a lot to work with already.
Thank you, Matt. So can we take a second question? Yes. And then that's it.
Okay, thanks for having me as a question. I read the English book, Postcapitalist Desire, and so we already mentioned consciousness raising and sort of traces of the counterculture that sort of go through until the mainstream in music. And I was just thinking about movies, and I know that Mark Fisher in like the first or the second lecture mentions this text by Gibson Graham that has the Full Monty. And I was just thinking if you could think of any like pop culturally significant movies, maybe also more recent ones that were coming out after Mark Fisher died, that sort of fit into this post-capitalist framework, let's say.
Oh. That's a very good. That's a very good question, and now that's going to be hard. I have some in mind, and I'm forgetting. I've put my phone somewhere. I can't even Google it on stage. What's the guy's name? I currently live in Newcastle upon Tyne, in the northeast of England, and this is kind of just me sketching a geography, like a map maybe, to finding who this person is. It's going to really bug me. Anyway, there are a lot of narratives from that region. It's a quite heavily deprived region, but another film that could be added to Mark's list of a similar sort of time is this film Billy Elliot. I don't know if anyone else is how popular it is outside the UK. It's really popular in the UK and has been for years. It's almost a classic at this point. It's about a young boy from Newcastle who is his dad wants him to be a man's man. His dad's is a striking miner, and is putting pressure on his kids to find jobs and stuff. And his son wants to be a ballerina. He wants to dance, and it's sort of this really nice tale of I guess there's like a conflict there of there's a sort of class mobility, sort of escaping his class narrative, but also of how this sense that within the conflict and the tumult of the miners' strikes, this young gay boy who wants to be a dancer, something from another world, a desire from another world, actually is easier to accept in a way because of how much else is changing. There's a few like that also in Newcastle. One film I can think of is called I, Daniel Blake. I can't remember that. Ken Loach's films, especially his most recent ones, I think, have a very similar kind of, like sort of social realist being an interesting word in the context of Mark Fisher, but that kind of approach that have been genuinely politically significant, I think, in the UK, because they've it's this realist approach that actually does highlight using kind of non-professional actors and things that has greatly raised awareness of a plight that is continuing. Though I feel like they're all quite wholesome and very rooted in reality. I feel like for Mark as a kind of cyberpunk, there would have to be like I'm trying to think of post-capitalist sci-fi now.
Can I give a suggestion?
Yes, please.
There was a film, I'm going to talk about Brazil again, I'm sorry. There's a film called Bacurau from Kleber Mendonça Filho. I don't know if you watched it. It's set in a small city in the northeast Brazil. And it's, it's a sci-fi punkish thing without professional actors. It's a mini city that one day disappears from the map, from Google Maps. And then a bunch of Americans and one German come to destroy the city. They were going to play like video games live with the human beings. Spoiler, I'm sorry. They organize against, and they win. But it's very absurd, everything that happens. So recommend that. Now, please.
It's I'm stuck on the point that we just in Germany we're falling so dreadfully short of anything like that. So those are good recommendations. I go with them, and yeah.
Billy Elliot was quite great. Yeah. Did you remember the film that you were trying to remember?
Oh, well, just Ken Loach. Ken Loach
I thought that you wanted to say another.
Sorry, no, it was the director.
No.
I couldn't remember Ken Loach's name, but yeah, he's been very prolific the past 10 years, and yeah, his films are amazing.
He is great.
Very difficult watches though. But yeah, harrowing depictions of contemporary working class life in the northeast of England, but he still manages to bring a hope and a confidence to them, despite also showing the harsh reality that our government wants to ignore.
With a lot of love too, I would say, for his
definitely.
characters. I hope you have take notes. You have a lot of movies to watch. That's it. We still can hang out and you still can ask questions to Matt and Alex. Thank you all for coming. If you didn't buy it yet or want to read, wait. shop.jacobin.de/Bücher. Buether. It's a note for myself. Thank you everyone for coming. Have fun and annoy the guests afterwards.
Thank you.